pleasure to introduce Geoff Henderson, who's going to give us a talk on John Evans, who I must admit I hadn't heard of, but it sounds an absolutely fascinating life, and I'm sure that Geoff, as always, is going to do us proud. So you please welcome him in the normal way.
Thank you. Can I be heard?
Yes.
Good. Does the technology work? I've been having trouble with this today. Yes.
Yes.
Right. So I'm going to talk about two people. One, John Hughes from Merthyr Tydfil, and the other is Nikita Khrushchev. Now, I think John Hughes shaped the life of Khrushchev and Khrushchev's thinking in some way that I hope to demonstrate in the course of the next hour or so. And therefore, I think he may have had an influence in the shape of the Soviet Union, which Khrushchev ran for the best part of 10 years or so. Now, who's John Hughes? Well, funnily enough, he was born in sight of Carvatha Castle, where we're going. And here's an advert. So there's another reason to go, is when you've heard something about John Hughes, you'll understand the place that this castle has in his life and in his thinking. So John Hughes himself was born either 1814 or 1815, no one's quite certain. His father was an engineer in the ironworks. That's typical housing conditions of the time. That's the row of cottages at St. Fagans. And this is a contemporary photograph. There it is, contemporary photograph of the steelworks at Ebbw Vale. Housing conditions weren't brilliant, and they weren't brilliant anywhere in the developing industrial world at the time. Cholera was endemic, so was typhoid. Frequent outbreaks of both of those killed lots of people. Ebbw Vale had the highest mortality rate in Wales in 1848. And when young John Hughes, who at the age of 14 went to work in the ironworks alongside his father, he'd have looked up the hill and seen this. And this was owned by the man who owned the ironworks, Mr. Khrushchev. Cost a great deal of money at the time, £30,000 at the time, about 3 or 4 million today, as best you can judge. And I think he may well have looked up at the castle as he was grinding away in the ironworks and thinking, well, I'd like to have some of that. That's the blood. And here's a wonderful painting of the works at the time. So he started there when he was 14, as I said. He learned all about iron making, he learned about steel making, he knew about making rails. Russia was a very substantial customer of the ironworks, and the majority of rails that were made here were sold into Russia. He made a career for himself. He started work at 14, so his education is pretty slight, but he made a career for himself. He moved from there to other works in the Rhondda Valley, and he was regarded as something of a top man. Some biographies describe him as something of an adventurer, a man with something about him. He wanted to achieve something in the world, and he knew what he wanted to be, and he was clearly good at it, because the rate at which his career moved was quite substantial. And he was clearly unafraid of a challenge, as we'll see on a number of occasions through his life. In about 1840, so he's about 25, he becomes general manager of one of the big iron foundries in Newport. He finds his wife at the Tredegar Arms, apparently demolished in the 1990s. He found his wife in the Tredegar Arms. Oh no, I suppose he found his girlfriend in the Tredegar Arms. I've got a very pedantic wife. Yeah. Yeah, see, they weren't married when he found her. And within 14 years, they had 8 children, 6 boys and 2 girls. There's no photograph of him at this stage. And the first photograph of him comes much, much later in his life. But he was a clever engineer, and he obtained patents in armor plating. And he was one of 3 patentees of this. And the building at Newport is still, it's not a foundry anymore, but it's still referred locally as the arms shop. So he's very innovative, he's smart, he's got patents to his name, he's building himself a reputation, to the point where he's headhunted as general manager of the Millwall Ironworks on the banks of the Thames. Now, I didn't know this till I started doing this, but the Great Eastern was built on the bank of the Thames. And at high tide, when it was launched, there were about 100 yards at either end. So they had to get a very high tide, or it was going to go up the bank on one side or fail to get down the bank on the other side. And this is a photograph of it under construction. And then these are photographs of it during his time. This is Milford Haven. This is what's left of the slipway at Millwall. And this is the Great Eastern taking on the transatlantic cable, which laying cable was what that became its forte. It wasn't successful at much else, and certainly not as much as Brunel intended. But it was a really good cable layer. And until the Great Eastern came along, ships of this size were trying to lay the cable across the Atlantic to see that it had something of an advantage. That 2,500 tons of cable. Now, because he had these patents in armor plating and was something of an expert, they won a contract to ironclad some of the Royal Navy's wooden-hulled ships. And that was very, very successful. So his reputation continued to grow. Now, the armor plating is key because we're now going to jump to Russia and St. Petersburg. St. Petersburg was the capital of Russia at the time. This, by the way, is called the English Embankment, even today. And it was the gem. It was not only the capital, it was the gem of the Russian and Romanov Empire. And it's protected by the fort of Kronstadt, which you can just see here. So Petersburg, St. Petersburg is here. This is the island of Kronstadt with 2 barriers across. And these are some of the forts. It's quite something. It's not a tiny island by any means. There's a wonderful church on it and lots of housing and lots of other things. But Millwall won the contract from Russia, from the Tsar, to iron plate the forts as a defensive measure. So not only was he known in Russia because he was associated with the building of railways, but he was being rewarded really for doing such a terrific job on Kronstadt. And here's the Tsar of the time. He's famous for a couple of things. One is the emancipation of the serfs. And he wanted to do that because he realized that Russia, to become strong, needed to industrialize. And you can't industrialize without railway lines and infrastructure. So railway lines were the key to this, and he realized buying them from Mobile is all very well and good, but we need an iron and a steel making industry of our own. That way we can develop. Now, I'm not sure whether he did this to pay for the ironworks, but he sold Alaska to America for $7.2 million in 1867. And he also realized that as a consequence, one of the reasons they didn't do terribly well in the Crimean War was they didn't have enough railway lines. They weren't able to move troops around quickly enough. So he had to do something. And he had previously sent an archduke to Merthyr Tydfil to have a look at how rails were made and what the technology was like. So you can imagine a Russian Grand Duke turning up, probably with more medals and braid than anyone had ever seen in their lives, taking a look at an ironworks. Anyway, the Tsar was impressed. He was impressed with the job that Hughes had done at Kronstadt, and he offered him the chance to establish an ironworks and coal mines in the Ukraine. Now, it's called New Russia because Russia referred to Ukraine as New Russia. It wasn't called the Ukraine at that point. So Hughes is a man with a sense of adventure. He's wealthy, he's very successful, he's got a family, he's got a wife, 8 children, he's living very well in Greenwich, in London, doesn't want for anything other than here's a big adventure coming and maybe own the house on the hill. So he forms the New Russia Company. He puts some of his own money into it, and he has no difficulty attracting investors because of his track record and his reputation. And so the company is formed. He goes to the Ukraine in 1869 to have a look around, to decide where's the best place to get the coal, and therefore, as close as I can to it, where's the best place to build an ironworks and to build a steelworks and so on. And he decides where that's going to be. This is the Ukraine, and he plonks it just there. I'll show you a bit. This is Kronstadt, just out of interest. And this is the chap, the member of the royal family or the nobility, from whom Hughes buys the land. And he eventually becomes one of the largest landowners in the Ukraine. See, he looks a bit like a church minister, but I think you'll have seen by now that he's not. Anyway, Prince, unpronounceable name, sells him the land. And this is the Crimea, which becomes relevant in a while also. So, he comes back after deciding where he's going to build his ironworks and where he's going to start developing coal mining. And in the summer of 1870, he sets off. He's 55 years old. He sails with 8 ships, typical of the time, these ships. All the equipment necessary to build an ironworks and establish a coal mining industry. And much of the skilled labour. A group of about 100 iron makers and coal miners recruited from around South Wales. This chap, John, didn't go out with the original party, but after he retired and returned to the valleys, he was always known as John Russia. And this is the earliest photograph I can find of anyone from the Hughes family in the ironworks, and the chap I've highlighted is one of his sons. So off he goes. He's got the equipment he thinks he needs. He's got labour that he thinks he needs. They're pretty skilled. And they land just here. This is a port, Taganrog, which was established by Peter the Great, and it was the first Russian port onto the Black Sea. The Donbass, the Donetsk Basin, is where the coal deposits are, so steelworks is going to go here. And being a modest fellow, he names it Hughes Town. This is very swiftly becomes Hughesovka, and equally swiftly becomes Yuzovka, the Russian for it. And it keeps that name for the best part of 50 years. So, he's got the ships in the harbour, all the equipment is in the harbour, and he's only got to carry this stuff 100 miles through the Russian winter by the time he gets there. And this is around about, you could do some sort of a count, but that's about 50 bullocks pulling a boiler 100 miles across frozen countryside, and everything has to be hauled from the port to Yuzovka. By the end of the first winter, of the 100 or so men who went out with him, there are 3 left. The others have given up. It's too cold. I'm going home. So he comes back and recruits again from all over South Wales, Mumbles, Glencorrog, Maesteg, Ebbw Vale, Cardiff, Newport, you name it, there's almost someone there. And by the end of that year, there are 42 families in Yuzovka, 164 people, and 2,500 bullocks. And surprise, surprise, he opens coal mines, and within a year, they're making iron. So just imagine the achievement of shifting that equipment across that terrain from scratch, and they're making iron. And one of the furnacemen from Dowlais wrote in a letter home that in 60 degrees of frost, he has seen puddlers working at the furnaces wearing sheepskin gloves and sheepskin jackets and sheepskin hats. And a puddler is a man who works, if that's the molten iron in some sort of vessel on that table, they're about this close to doing this with it, to get the slag to the top and all the rest of it. But they're wrapped up in sheepskin. It's that cold. It's around about 11 to 1200 degrees Fahrenheit, liquid iron. And these are some photographs taken around about the time. This one we know was taken in 1872. And these are the puddlers. See, sheepskin, sheepskin, and sheepskin. And the height of these snowdrifts into the works. So it's a colossal achievement to establish an ironworks out in the tundra with that sort of weather. In the summer, it's unbearably hot. Mosquitoes are the size of bumblebees. And in the winter, the snowdrifts are taller than your house. But undeterred, within a few years, he's also built a steelworks, and they're producing 8,000 tons of rail. However, they employ very few Ukrainians. The Ukrainians are much more interested in the country and in farming and their rural stock. So most of the workers that he's hiring in now for this enterprise and for other companies who've gone there, attracted by the fact that Hughes is there and there's money to be made, are Russians coming across the border. And Tsar Alexander saw some of this before he was assassinated in 1881. But he would have been patting himself on the back, I think, for making a good choice. I've picked this Welshman. I asked him to build me miles and miles of rails, or kilometres, and he's done it. And he builds a town. And that part of the town, which today is called Donetsk, that part of the town is still referred to as the English colony. And this is Mr. Hughes' house. So he's got the house on the hill. It's in the best part of town. He decided which was the best part of town, and that's where he put his house. Put these other buildings up. One is a library, one's a hospital. He even had a football team. And there's a hint that Khrushchev himself may have played for the football team. I don't know what position, I don't even know if it's true, but I found one reference to it. He built churches, he built Christian churches, and he built Russian Orthodox churches. This is the hospital. So over 20 years, they built tea rooms, pubs, wine shops, libraries, everything that you would have wanted and expected if you were reasonably well off in the UK, that's what you'd have had. And paid much more than the locals were paid. There was culture. They had visiting musicians once a week into the Hughes home, concert pianists and chamber orchestras and so on. And they put on plays. He died himself in 1889. And in St. Petersburg while he was trying to close another deal. And he's immensely wealthy by this point. Impossible to establish quite how wealthy and how he compares, but one author in the US compares him with Rockefeller. and with Andrew Carnegie, the steel man. And he claimed that they have many similarities, one of which is money. He also takes a Russian wife, because Mrs. Hughes is still at home in London with the 2 daughters and 2 of the sons, as Mr. Hughes has gone to Yuzovka with 4 of the sons. And at a family reunion in 2009, one of his biographers meets John Hughes's granddaughter, and she's about 85 in this tale. And she remembers her mother talking about her grandfather. Now, what's really astonishing about all this is you've got a bloke who left school at 14, not much of an education, who becomes very, very wealthy man. And what is staggering is he apparently couldn't read other than capital letters. Now, and he couldn't write. He was at best semi-literate. And absolutely no document exists which has his signature on it, or that he's written, or any evidence that he's read. Now, I puzzled about this for quite some time. I thought, that's inconceivable to me. Okay, he left school at 14 and he had no qualifications. He was never formally educated after that. But to be able to be granted patents for quite complex technical design struck me as a bit too far. Now, there are 3 biographies written about Mr. Hughes. One is written by a chap called Roderick Heather, who lives in Chester. So I thought, can't be that many Heathers in Chester. So I went to directory inquiries and found there were 2. One was R and one was something else. And so I thought, well, I'll ring, see what I can find out. Anyway, I got him. I said, do you happen to be Mr. Roderick Heather, who wrote the book about John Hughes? Yes, he said. I said, have you got a few minutes to talk? I'd like to ask you a few questions. Well, as long as it's not more than a few minutes, he said, expecting guests for dinner in half an hour. So he said, what can I do for you? I said, I'm trying to get to the bottom of could he read and could he write? And he said, well, he's been through the records at the Glamorgan Record Office in Cardiff, and there are buckets of documents. There's a huge archive. And one of the other biographies of him is written by the lady who's currently the county archivist, and I had a long conversation with her as well. And he said, in all my research, I found nothing, and I got more and more frustrated about it because I didn't believe it was possible for someone to achieve what he's achieved without being able to read or write. And he said, but I reluctantly came to the conclusion that that was the case because I found no evidence to the contrary, and I found a number of references to the fact that he was barely literate. So I thought, well, fair enough then. And then I got from the records office one of the patents, and they're very detailed technical drawings. And there's not a lot of wording on it, but of course a man of his position would have had secretaries to dictate to and someone to read to him and so on. And I discussed the drawings with a friend of mine who's good at that sort of thing and built up a big engineering business based on blueprints, all of this sort of stuff he deals with every day. And I said, if you could barely read and you could barely write, how do you specify something like this? And he looked at the drawings and he said, well, what you do is you say to a technical drawer, draw a line to the left of that or to the right of that, and then you want to overlap this. And it's the armor plating patent's very complex overlay of sheets of iron. And he came to the conclusion it was perfectly possible that he could indeed have been the creator of these patents, as was the case. The patent office clearly thought so, but that he wouldn't have had to be able to read and write. So we have one of the wealthiest Welshmen who probably ever lived, apart from the current Chris Evans, who was semi-literate and established an ironworks and a coal mining business in the Ukraine because he was driven to, I think. I think he wanted a house on the hill, I want some of that, and I'm driven, and I'm going to do it. And his legacy lived on after his death. But the key thing about this, his 4 sons took over the business after he died and carried on running the company in the same way, producing, by this point, thousands of kilometres of railway lines. And the steel makers and the iron makers and his top men were living rather well. As you can see, plenty of facilities, home from home. Probably in spring and autumn, and not so in summer and winter. But like everywhere in the developing industrial world, it did depend what side of these railway tracks you lived. And immediately the other side of the railway tracks was the housing for some of the immigrant workers, but the skilled people. So skilled engineers in particular. Housing wasn't at all bad at the time. But if you were just a coal miner and you were down the mines and you were a labourer or whatever and you were unskilled, then crikey, there was a difference. And this is the main street of the other side of the railway line in 1887, and they're dirt tracks. They have open sewers, there's no running water, there were a dozen standpipes, and there are 40,000 people living in this place by about 1910. Again, it's probably not radically different from some of the conditions around the UK at the time, but the contrast, like in the UK, was pretty dramatic. The coal mines and the steel works and the iron works were famous for the accident rate, as well as famous for producing what was to become almost 90% of Russia's coal and steel output. And top people there were paid 12 to 15 times what the other folks were getting. So you had this huge inequality. And contemporary accounts talk about mud and stench, violence and drink. Vodka and religion were the opium of the masses there. One book says they took their religion extremely seriously. They had 150 holy days holiday a year, which wouldn't have pleased many industrialists, but they took their vodka even more seriously. The working conditions were brutal. Typical working day, 14 to 16 hours, paid in coupons, not in money, unless you were living the other side of the tracks. Living conditions were dreadful, very few doctors. The hospital was there for the better off workers and the more qualified workers. And Hughes' rules were pretty draconian, and so were those of his sons. If you were late for work, it cost you a day's pay. You had to work the shift, but it cost you a day's pay. And if you missed a shift, you had to work 3 days in order to catch up. And if you complained, then you were going to be in deep trouble. This is, after all, Russia is run by a very repressive monarchy, absolute monarchy. And it's extremely brutal. The way any dissent is put down is with the Cossacks. And one of Khrushchev's earliest memories when he goes to live in Yuzovka is Cossacks on horseback, just cutting their way through a crowd, sabres at the ready, leaving dead people everywhere. That's one of his first memories of the town. Public floggings were not uncommon, so you did as you were told. And Russia is advertised abroad as a great place to invest because it has low wages and an obedient workforce. And this catches it perfectly, I think. And this is a revolutionary poster of the time. And down here we have coal miners and farmers and other workers. And the attitude is, we work for them. And by and large, it's only these folks at the bottom who pay any taxes. So the royalty and the nobility dispose of the money. The church prays on our behalf. The management and the bureaucracy eat on our behalf. And the Cossacks shoot at us. And we work for them. And then you just go round the loop again. So you've got a revolutionary ferment going on underneath all of this. And this is from a report published at the time. And in 1 year alone, there were 1,200 deaths. And fewer than 5% of the population live into old age. Nearly half the labour force injured every year. So that's the situation that Khrushchev arrives in. So we've got two tales here. We've got one of a man, John Hughes, who's achieved astonishing things. And now we've got another man entering the story in Mr. Khrushchev. And I found out about John Hughes, I'd never heard of him. And I know a lot of other people who've never heard of him. And I happened to be rereading a biography of Khrushchev that my daughter gave me for Christmas some 15 years ago. And I was rereading it because it wasn't yet Christmas and I'd run out of books that I hadn't read, so I thought I'll read this one again. And on about page 10, Khrushchev mentions this Welshman, John Hughes. And I thought, oh, I wonder who he was. And that's who he was. So Khrushchev's born 1894, the same year as Tsar Alexander died, the follow-on. And he's born in Russia, just across the border. That's all I can find out about where he was born. His family was religious. He didn't have any shoes. He was a peasant. He looked after cattle for his uncle. His father moved to Yuzovka for work as a miner. And he took Khrushchev out of school when Khrushchev was 14 years old. And his father said to him, you can now count to 30. And the only thing you'll ever need to count in your life is money, and you'll never have more than 30 rubles. So, out of school, come and get a job. His mother refers to him in the family home as my Tsar. Now, mums and dads say this sort of thing to their kids, but that may just have penetrated. And he met a lady in a forest on one occasion, and she told him that he was going to amount to something. A big future awaits you, she told him. And that may have registered as well. But we don't know whether he was inspired by all of that or not. I think, like John Hughes, he was a very driven man. And I'll show you why in a moment. So he started work at 14, same age as Hughes. Also following his father, another similarity. First time he goes there, he's barefoot and he sees the Cossacks massacring the Jews. In this particular case, there's a pogrom going on, and the Jews, the Romanovs, were very anti-Semitic. So there was a lot of nastiness, and that persisted for a long time. He moved in with his father, and they shared 2 small rooms with a number of other families. So he's living well the wrong side of the railway lines at this point. And they're living in a barracks a little later on. But he's a rebel and a troublemaker from the start. His father organizes an apprenticeship for him. It doesn't last very long, he gets fired. So he moves to another mine, becomes something of a stirrer, and he starts to agitate, and he gets fired. Goes to a bigger job, this one serving a number of mines. And he's clearly quite a good engineer, because even with his reputation as a troublemaker, he's not finding it difficult to get work. But he continues to agitate. And then he moves to a repair shop where he's got a bigger audience because he's meeting more people, and guess what? He becomes an even bigger agitator. And he sells revolutionary journals at the colliery gates and that sort of thing. And he gets to the point where he's well recognized by his co-workers, not only as a serious stirrer, but as a good negotiator, and someone they want to represent them in negotiations with the management and the owners of the coal mines. And this is another very interesting aspect of Khrushchev. He's invited to go and settle a dispute with one of the major conglomerates operating down there. And this is a chance for glory. And he says no, because in the invitation, he's asked, we'd like you to come and negotiate and record the contract that you negotiate. And he turns it down because he can't write. He's had no education. He's like John Hughes. He's had no education either. But he's really looked up to by people. He's admired. People say, oh, I look up to him. And the other thing they say about him, he stands up to people. So he's someone that the workers want on their side. And this next slide will be something of a surprise. This is the photograph that most of us have never seen of Khrushchev. Mr. Cool, 1916. He's 22 years old, and that's with his first wife. He's fairly prosperous because as an engineer working, he's got a good job, he's well paid, he's living well. And this is not the image that we have, by and large, of Khrushchev. Baggy suits and ill-fitting suits and all that sort of stuff. His memoirs recall that he was well paid and that if you were well paid, you could live well. That wages were good and food and so on was much cheaper. And he's writing this in retirement, musing on the success or otherwise of the Soviet Union. And because of the war, the owners are doing really well. Money is pouring in, but not for most workers. And he becomes even more radical. His wife here didn't last more than a year or two. She died in a typhoid epidemic. Sorry, my throat is dry. So the working conditions in Uzovka and everything else that's going around, the repression and all the rest of it is beginning to get to this. And he's becoming very, very radicalized. And in 1917, Arthur Balfour, who is the Foreign Secretary, asks the embassy in St. Petersburg to send someone into the Donbass to report on working conditions. What's all this trouble that's going on in the Donbass? Mine owners and ironworks owners are being arrested by the workers. Soviets are being established. Places beginning to fall into chaos. And this is what Mr. Dickinson says. It's a wonder they've not gone further than they have. And about the only thing they hadn't done was to string people up. You can't imagine any diplomat in today's world writing something like that about another country. And some of the workers, by this point, the Hughes brothers are beginning to leave, and it's debatable whether they were pushed or whether they decided now's a good time to cash in the chips, but they start leaving. But lots of other workers stay, and descendants of those folks are still there. Then along comes Lenin and the revolution. Russia gets out of the war, and one of the reasons that they're not successful in the war is that they haven't enough regular lines to shift enough troops. Thank you very much. Excuse me a second. As a coal mining engineer, Khrushchev himself is in a reserved occupation, but as soon as the revolution starts, he joins the Red Army. And by the time he's 26, he's a political commissar. Now these are the guys responsible for the morale, for people's morale and making sure the party line is followed. These are the enforcers of the time. And this is him with his colleagues. He's by this point, he's the deputy director of one of the coal mines, as well as having this political appointment. So he's got himself quickly in a very powerful position. And it's a great start to his career. And what a career. 4 years later, he's Deputy Director of Political Affairs. His career shoots up. He marries a second time. It's questionable whether it's a legal marriage or not, but it didn't last very long. The lady died. So he marries for the third time the lady that we all know, Nina Petrovna. She's the lady who's familiar from all the photographs we remember of Khrushchev in the 60s. And then in 1924, Yuzovka becomes Stalino. Now, some writers say that this is in no way trying to suck up to Stalin. And many books say that Stalin took his name for the Russian for steel, the man of steel. But I don't think it's a coincidence that just after Stalin takes over, they call it Stalino. And I also don't think it's much of a coincidence that a few years after Stalin dies, they call it Donetsk. Anyway, he does get some education. In 1928 to 1931, he goes to an industrial college in Moscow. So he's got some education under his belt, and he had to fight for that because the bureaucrats around him and the Communist Party people around him were saying, no, you don't need education. But he knows that he can barely read and he can barely write. He describes himself as a coal miner. You don't want to be describing yourself as a peasant at this point in the Soviet Union. It's the workers are the people who decide things. So he's forgotten his brief time as a peasant. He's a worker. And he's very active during the Second World War. And he becomes first secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in 1953. And he just manages to survive Stalin's purges. Only just. But he's clearly an intriguer. He's foxy. He's got peasant cunning. He's a very, very smart cookie, this guy. And he becomes party boss in 1955. So, started with at 14 with no education, and here he is running the 6th largest country in the world. This is his third wife. This is him during the Second World War. And of course, come 1956, he denounces Stalin. This caused uproar in the communist world. The split with Tito caused the split with Albania, all sorts of things. And what he said about Stalin was condemning him for the mass terror of the 1930s, where millions of people were killed and were sent to Siberia and whatever. He eliminated the officer class just before the Second World War, which meant that they were in no position to properly, sensibly defend themselves when Germany invaded in 1941. All the deportations, the cult of personality, was condemned for all sorts of things. But Khrushchev, you don't get to this position without having blood on your hands either. Most of the death sentences that were passed on anyone of any influence in the Communist Party and in the Soviet Union, Stalin would put his initials on a list. He'd be given a list, and he'd say to people, what 100 people are we going to kill tomorrow? And if you came back with 99, you got a kicking. So you came along with 100. And he'd put his initials on it. And he'd pass it round the table to make sure that everyone in the Politburo or the cabinet or whatever committee it was, their initials were there as well. So there is as much, not as much, but there's certainly blood on Khrushchev's hands as there is for the rest of the leadership. But he's still driven to do something. And this speech, Gorbachev described himself as a child of 1956. This was the speech that inspired Gorbachev and people like him and of his generation, that we don't have to revert to Stalinist terror. We can actually do better than that. So it was a very, very influential but thoroughly unpopular thing. Chairman Mao went potty over it. And in 1958 he becomes premier, so he's absolutely top man. A couple of years later, Stalino is named Donetsk, which is what it's called today. Stalin can't quarrel with it now he's gone. And when Khrushchev meets Rockefeller on his trip, one of his first trips to America, and Rockefeller says, well, of course, we got all these Russian engineers came over in 1917 and 1918 after the revolution. They came here for the freedom. And Khrushchev said, rubbish. They came for the money. Because he said, I knew what I was earning, and I knew what these guys were earning. And in 1958, he compared the Western leaders he was trying to negotiate with. He was trying to set up a summit meeting between the Americans, the Brits, the French, and the Russians. And they kept dilly-dallying. They didn't want to do it, so they kept shilly-shallying on the date. And they'd offer a date, and then they'd change their minds and whatever. And this is one of the reasons that his experience in Yuzovka sticks in his memory and affects the way he thinks, was he said, I compare you lot with Hughes and the coal mining owners, because they told us we'd all get paid at the end of the month. And the problem was they didn't tell us which month. So it stuck in his mind. And right throughout his memoirs, it's impossible to read. There's 2 volumes of Khrushchev's memoirs. And I think they're honestly written. And he couldn't have written it in a particular way without believing it, I think. There's just too many words. And he dictated it all into a tape recorder, and the tapes were smuggled out of Russia, and it was printed in America. And there are constant references to how better things were at the time he was developing his career in the Ukraine. There are constant references to how inefficient Soviet industry is, or Soviet farming is, and there's plenty of statistics to it. He visits Eisenhower at Eisenhower's farm at Gettysburg, and Eisenhower gives him 3 cattle. He breeds a particular breed of cattle, which is a great producer of beef. And he gives 3 of these to Khrushchev, and Khrushchev has them shipped back to the USSR and sends them to some research institute to tell me how they do it, because these cattle produce 2.5 times as much meat as we do with our cattle. Why is that? And he's constantly looking for things to try and improve the lot of Soviet people, and he's constantly running into something that he clearly, from his memoirs, doesn't understand. And I think it's called incentive, that workers have no incentive at all to do any better. And just before the Second World War, they're having trouble, as an example of the way it works, they're having trouble with the quality of tyres on their trucks and on their personnel carriers and so on, that they want to move troops around it. The tyres keep failing. And he's sent by Stalin to try and understand why this is the case. And he goes to the factory, and he goes to the factory floor. He says, interesting, no point in talking to the managers, they don't know anything. He goes to the shop floor to observe what they're doing. And he starts asking people, why do you do this? Why do you do that? Why do you do the other? The factory has been supplied by Goodyear. And the specifications for making the tyres have been supplied by Goodyear. And Goodyear tyres last for thousands and thousands of miles. And the Russian ones, if they're lucky, last for hundreds of miles. And when he gets talking to the guys on the shop floor, he says, is this exactly according to the procedure that you're given? No, we don't do it the way they said, because we've got production targets. And the only way we can meet the production target is we skimp on the manufacture. So they wrap lots and lots of wires around the tyre. That's the extent of my tyre manufacturing knowledge. And they were skimping on that, so the walls were as strong as they ought to have been, and the things failed. And he's as frustrated as hell about this, and the only way he fixes it is to withdraw the production target and to put guess what? A quality target in instead. And after that, they don't have a problem. But it drives him potty. And I can remember a quote from towards the end of the East German Democratic Republic, one of the workers in East Germany, when they were talking about, well, of course, you guys in East Germany, you've got full employment, and you've got medical this, and all free education and whatever. And their standard of living is appalling, and they know it's appalling because they've only got to look at TV to see what it's like in West Germany. And one of the workers says, well, it's like this, you see. They pretend to pay us, and we pretend to work. And that was it. And you see it all over the place. Vera and I had a short holiday in East Germany just as the wall was coming down, and we were astonished at some of the things that we saw. Anyway, Khrushchev dominates the headlines in the late 50s and early 60s, and he's hugging one of his favorite chaps here. This is Gagarin, Nixon, of course, and this is Khrushchev looking at the Lincoln Memorial on his first visit. And he meets Kennedy in Vienna, and Kennedy comes out of the meeting saying, God, I have never been so beaten up in my life. He kicked me all over the room. And Khrushchev ran rings around him. Kennedy was thoroughly unprepared. He thought charm and savoir-faire was going to work, and it didn't. And that has very telling consequences, that meeting, because come 1962, we get the Cuban Missile Crisis. And Khrushchev has completely misread Kennedy's determination. Because he was able to kick him about, he thought, I can do what I want with this guy. And they've got missiles in Turkey pointed at us, so I'm going to plonk some in Cuba and point them at them. And all of us will have lived through that Cuban Missile Crisis and the blockade. I mean, these are only cartoons, but crikey, they're deadly serious. And there were enough warheads on both sides to wipe out half the planet, even at that point. Apparently now we could wipe it out 10 times over or something. But Khrushchev backed down. But only after Castro had said to him, we'll sacrifice ourselves. Just set the rockets at America. We don't care. And Khrushchev says, you must be potty. And that's a terrific quote, I think. The living will envy the dead. And Khrushchev had a battle in the Politburo about backing off because they didn't want to be seen to be backing off. And of course, the private, later became public deal was, we'll take the missiles out of Cuba, you take the missiles out of Turkey. That was the deal. And now we know from records that are more accessible in the Kremlin, that Chairman Mao had said to Khrushchev, well, let's have a war. Let's fire the rockets. Between us, we're 1 billion. America's only 300 million. We'll lose 700 million, but we'll have 300 million left. And these guys will only have 30 million left. So we'll have won. How bonkers is that? And happily, Khrushchev is, in his memoirs says he thinks that Mao was insane. But can you imagine someone, okay, 300 million left and we've won. But after the missile crisis, there's the more subtle change. Before then, a lot of the photographs of him meeting foreign diplomats and statesmen and so on, he comes across as a rather genial, buffoon-like character, badly dressed, but buffoon-like. Certainly far more badly dressed than he was in the bow tie when he was 22 years old. And he starts rants, he becomes uncontrollable, no one quite knows what he's going to say. He dictates speeches to secretaries, he gets on the podium and he throws it away and boom, off he goes. The economy's in a mess. I mean, to some extent, his rants remind me of Trump, except Trump's are shorter, they're only 140 characters on Twitter. But he's upsetting everybody. He's upsetting the West, he's upsetting the rest of the Politburo, he's upsetting the Soviet satellites. So he's got very few people on his side at this point. And there is this one, how many of you remember him banging his shoe on the podium at the United Nations? Well, apparently we didn't. Historians say that this is a doctored picture. This is the original picture, and this is the shoe. And his son, Khrushchev's son Sergei, says he never wore shoes like that. So, anyway, one of his statements was to the West, we will bury you. So he's becoming belligerent, but he's got no control over what he's saying to anybody anymore. And to the point where he's deposed. The Central Committee call him into the Kremlin, and they say, that's it. It's over. So he's deposed peacefully, which was unusual generally over there. At that point, you died in office, and the next 3 did as well. But just 2 years after Cuba. So now he becomes an unperson. He's deleted from the Soviet encyclopedia. He's deleted from newsreels, from photographs. It's classic 1984 stuff, really. Ministry of Information, or the Ministry of Truth. He's an unperson. But they say to him, you can have your country house, you can have a big apartment, you can have a pension, and what he ends up with is a small country house, and a small apartment, and a small pension, because they lied to him. But they lied to everybody, didn't they, really? As did he. But at least he goes off to retire. And this is a shot of him in retirement out at his country Dasha. And he brooded in retirement, I think, and his memoirs are dictated while he's in retirement. And he says, all these guards around the house, are they there to protect me? Or are they there to protect everybody else? And he muses on the fact things were better and we could have been better. And he clearly has fonder memories of Hughes and his time for the workers who mattered to Mr. Hughes, as well as he's not lost any of his idealism. But I think he's coming to realise that communism simply wasn't working for people. The standard of living was poor. And every time he went abroad, he was reminded of how poorly the Soviet Union compared with the places he was visiting. He died in 1971. And I don't think he'd have expected to be buried with Lenin and Stalin in the mausoleum in Red Square. But before he died, one of the things he did after the speech of 1956 was to have Stalin removed from the mausoleum. And he got the Politburo to pass a resolution saying Stalin should be removed. He wasn't worthy to lie alongside Stalin. And that very night, along they go, and they take Stalin out. And the people who do the work are terrified because they can't quite, the coffin's very heavy, and they can't quite keep it level, and they've got it at 45 degrees, and they're all terrified that Stalin is going to roll out or slide out at the end. And they dig a hole outside the Kremlin wall, where there are some other graves, and they put Stalin in the grave, and then they put 5 lorry loads of concrete on the top. So he's doing a pretty permanent job here. But anyway, Khrushchev isn't going to go there. And you'd think that with the other leaders of the Soviet Union, he'd have gone into the Kremlin wall. But it was not to be. His death was only announced at the hour of his funeral because the authorities didn't want any show of support for this chap. And only one member of the Politburo turned up. That was Mikoyan, who turned up with a bunch of flowers, went, and then ran away, didn't want to be seen. And in a survey done about 3 or 4 years ago, which asked a population in Russia to say, who do you think were the best and worst rulers of the Soviet Union and Russia in the last 100 years? The only guy who, he gets 50-50, but did more harm than good, so 50%, you're right in the middle, you did as much harm as you did good, is Khrushchev. The other guys are way down, did much more harm than good. He's the only one who pops up. Anyway, he's buried in the best cemetery in Moscow, alongside Chekhov and Prokofiev, who happened to be, Prokofiev was born in Yuzovka, or the hamlet that was Yuzovka before it became Yuzovka. But it took 4 years for the family to be able to put up a gravestone. This is about life size. It's about 6 feet. So that's the tradition. You put up a photograph and you put the flowers around it. And the family kept asking the authorities if they could put a headstone up. And they didn't ever get a no, and they never got a yes. And after 4 years, they said, oh, bugger it, we'll put it up. And they did, and no one stopped them. And the only other memorial I can find to him is in the Crimea, in a place called Partenit. And I can find no relationship between Khrushchev and Partenit at all. His memoirs and biographies, everything written about him, mentions where they went for their holidays, down to the Black Sea and all the rest of it, Georgia especially. No mention of this place at all, and it shows him with a dog. It shows him the way that he often dressed in retirement, with a peasant smock and an overcoat. But this is a cat, and he never had a cat, but he did always have a dog. Mr. Hughes did somewhat better. This is the Institute of Technology in Donetsk, and this was put up in 2001. And the date on here is 1869, which was the year that the new Russia company, John Hughes Company, was formed and founded the city, and here he is. Very nice memorial. Now, when Khrushchev visited the UK, sometime in the late 50s, he met John Griffiths. Was it John Griffiths? Jim Griffiths, who was Secretary of State, Shadow Secretary of State for Wales. And he said to him, Mr. Griffiths, who was John Hughes? Tell me about John Hughes. And John Hughes said, never heard of him. Donetsk, the city that he founded, was voted by UNESCO in 1970 the cleanest and most beautiful industrial city in the world. Despite all the iron and steel works and 15 collieries, 20 different companies, a city of 1 million roses, they planted a rose bush for every child born after the war. As for today, it's part of the scrap. This is the disputed area of the Ukraine. And the darker the colour, the more heavily Russian is spoken. And this was it before the scrap. So this was to do with Russian workers coming into the Ukraine. And this was the rural economy, really. And this is the Crimea. So very heavily Russian speaking down here. And the Crimea was given to the Ukraine by Stalin. It was previously Russian. And that was a decision that Khrushchev confirmed a couple of years after he became party leader. So it doesn't have a long history of belonging to the Ukraine. But it's a really nasty part of the world now. And this is from a recent article in the Times. So you've got the Lugansk People's Republic here, the Donetsk People's Republic here, the Crimea separated. And most of the businesses in here, because it's still a coal-making centre, a coal-producing centre, iron and steel-making centre, a lot of factories, are owned by Ukrainians. And until yesterday, the coal mines here were exporting coal into Russia and whatever, but the revenues were going to the mine owners in Kiev. And the 20,000 or so miners and people who work in the coke ovens here are providing the majority of electricity for here. So if they were to stop doing that, who knows what's going to happen? And yesterday it did. They closed, the separatists closed the railway lines into the Ukraine, so they've put a block on the exports, and they've also blocked the exports of power. Only 24 hours ago, so no one knows what's going to happen next. But that threatens around about 75,000 jobs, and with all the economic hits that will entail. And this is part of Donetsk today, after the invasion of the Russian-backed separatists. This is the airport, what's left of it. Now, Khrushchev would recognise that from his time in the Second World War, but John Hughes most certainly wouldn't. John Hughes wouldn't believe it, probably. I don't know what's happened to the English colony in Donetsk. I don't know what's happened to his statue. I've emailed the university and didn't get a reply. I've emailed the college, didn't get a reply. I've emailed the Ukrainian embassy in London, didn't get a reply. The Ukrainian consulate in Manchester, or where it is, didn't get a reply. I've rung hotels in Donetsk. They've got there are a couple of well-known international names, hotels, people like Hilton. I can't remember if it is Hilton, but I've rung them and asked the question, hey, do you speak English? Because I don't speak Ukrainian. And had yes, but as soon as I ask the question, phone goes down. So I've been able, and the lady who runs the archive in Cardiff, who spent a lot of time in Donetsk while she was writing the biography, she has no contacts there anymore, so she can't find out either. So we've no idea. But I think what we do have is a tale of a Welshman who influenced a Russian and built a place that's been... And Hughes, can you hear me if I shout?
Yes.
Okay, I'll shout. This is the last poem. I asked Sergei Khrushchev, that's Khrushchev's son, who lives in America now, and he taught at Duke University in Rhode Island. So I emailed him, and I said, what do you think was John Hughes' effect on your father? And the quote that he gave me was that his experience there transformed him from a simple peasant boy to an active political leader. He said, I'm sorry I can't add anything to that. I think perhaps he was hoping I'd find quote Khrushchev, my father, but it's dreadful. I've read bits of it, it's dreadful. But for sure, his experience with Hughes radicalized him, and with the other mine workers and so on. It created contempt for capitalists and capitalism. And I think also, though, that he saw that it could be better, and he wanted better for the Soviet people, and sadly, he didn't get it. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take any questions. Yeah, I'm back in business. Happy to take any questions if anyone wants. Yes, Margaret.
Are school children in Russia taught how to vote?
Today, I don't know, but I wouldn't think so. I should think that he's probably the least popular leader of the current regime. You know, the current regime, they've made a saint of Nicholas II, don't they? So, I shouldn't think so.
Are there any other questions?
Should we be proud of John Hughes?
Sorry?
Should we feel proud of John Hughes or not?
Well, I am. But I'm also proud of Khrushchev. Yeah, I think I've believed for decades that it's individuals that change things. Sometimes they change things for the better, and sadly, sometimes they change things for the worse. But I do believe in the power of individuals, and Hughes was clearly one of those. And in his way, so was Khrushchev. But he was a man of his time. You know, he was probably no different to any of his contemporaries. At the time, he just was a harder driver of things. And despite his lack of education, you know, was a clever, clever man.
Geoff, by about 1960, Khrushchev was losing it and was very much the loose cannon.
Yes.
And the Cuban Missile Crisis was something that the Russians did not want. And as we know, it brought us to the edge of World War. The Russians then realized they'd lost face in the eyes of the world. And that as much as anything, them turning the boats back was the end of Khrushchev.
Yes. That's right, he lasted just 2 years beyond that, didn't he?
Is there anybody else? David?
Sorry, David.
When Khrushchev came to Wales, he was with Bulgarian as well, I think.
Yes.
There was a scheduled visit to the National Estate,
Right.
which happened to be in Flint. Now, the people of Flintshire, if they don't like somebody, Flint happens to be on the banks of the River Dee.
Yes.
They have a habit of throwing people they don't like into the River Dee. So their visit was rescheduled and they never got to the National Estate. As it happened in that estate, that my mother won one of the prizes for a cushion that she had made.
There is a story that I've not been able to verify that Stalin visited Wales at some point, but he was famous for leaving the USSR only once or twice and then in an armoured train. So I don't see how he could have got an armoured train to Abu Vale. But it's buried in the mists of time somewhere. Sorry, you were...
John Hughes and his four sons lived in Russia a long time. Did they speak Russian? How did they communicate with their
I don't know that John Hughes did. I think he had some, but his sons certainly did. And I think they only came back when they saw the writing on the wall in 1917 because they were making money hand over fist. And the coal miners, like coal miners everywhere, were amongst the first to start kicking out the owners and taking over and nationalising and whatever. And after the revolution, some of the biggest problems that Lenin had was with the coal miners in the Ukraine. They didn't want to be bossed around by anybody.
Are there any other questions?
Can I just comment on one thing you said?
Please.
When Khrushchev was at the United Nations,
Yes.
and they were talking about the fact that he language. From what I can remember, he did indeed do it because it was on newsreel.
Yes.
So I don't think it was just a doctored picture.
No, I think that's from the cine reel of it. But it's interesting that when I started, I knew nothing about him at all. And my starting point, therefore, was Khrushchev. And why was Khrushchev talking about this chap? And I think I've got it on the next chart. Yeah. So these are the sources for this talk. And I've not been able to get in touch with Colin Thomas, but I have spoken to Roderick Heather, Susan Edwards, and Sergei Khrushchev by email or by phone. And it depends where you start. Colin Thomas is very unsympathetic to Hughes. He's very, very left-wing, and that's his starting position. He hates capitalism right at the start. Roderick Heather's a touch more balanced, I think. And when you put together something like this and you read this, in addition to the mountains of stuff that's available on the internet through university websites and other websites, and you find yourself having to decide which version you believe and where you sit. And so you're balancing up, what do I think are the probabilities of having done this or done that or done the other? And you sort of, I don't think it pays to start off with a point of view and then look to justify it. But there are as many people say, I mean, his son is adamant that it didn't happen, and his son was with him in America at the time. And then, as you say, there's footage that shows him doing it. So I don't know, who do you believe, really? You look at it and you think, yeah, I think that's likely, or I think that's unlikely. Oh, it's my pacemaker again.
Right. Okay, if there aren't any more questions, I found that was absolutely fascinating. I didn't know anything about this gentleman beforehand, and I hadn't realised the impact he had on basically a substantial part of Russian history, the steelmaking industry and all that. I thought this was an absolutely fascinating talk. Thank you very much, Geoff. Put over incredibly well, as we would expect. Could we show Geoff our appreciation in the usual way, please?